What is up, you guys? Welcome back to another after hours session. We're going to do another little building update. So the topic of this particular update is going to be this 600-gallon Peninsula Show Tank here. Now, originally, I didn't have a great sense of what I wanted to do with this tank at all. It has kind of been like this little experiment with chaos theory. Sometimes staff members will just put corals in. Sometimes the stuff will just get rearranged by fish. It was really left to its own devices. And I would have to say that over time, it's filled out nicely, and it kind of looks like there was some sort of rhyme or reason to this. And I promise you, there was not. So it has a mix of a lot of different stony corals. It's a lot of hammers. There's a lot of torches in here. I see some pectinia, some gonies, some montipora, things of that sort. So it really is this hodgepodge, I would say. Kind of a mixed reef, but definitely a hodgepodge. The only thing that I wanted to avoid initially was any SPS because that's kind of covered in the other show tank that we have. But given that this tank has been up for about a couple of years now, I'm sort of finding some direction for it. One thing that we don't have as far as a show tank in this entire building is a show tank that features soft corals and leathers. There are a couple aspects of this tank that really suits that type of stocking, so let's get into it. Looking at some of these corals, several of them are looking a little pale, very kind of ghostly bleachy. And originally, I thought that it might have been because of the type of lighting that we have. This is some crazy Orphic lighting that's kind of designed for public aquariums that are 20 feet deep and stuff like that. It is not meant for a 2-foot deep tank, but I was professionally curious. I wanted to see how well those lights performed. So I was thinking that maybe we were blasting these guys with too much light. And to some degree, it is brighter than some of our other tanks, but nothing that is so insanely bright that we should be seeing the kind of bleaching that we do. Now, you might be thinking, well, maybe it's some kind of water chemistry thing. Unlikely, because while this is a 600-gallon show tank, it is connected to a farming system. And the total water volume now, we're looking at something in the neighborhood of 2,500 gallons. And we don't have the similar bleachiness going on for the same sort of corals in the farming tanks. So it really is kind of an issue that's isolated to this tank. I was here at about 5 o'clock one day, and it was a bright, bright sunny day, but clearly later afternoon. It turns out that we have these windows, and we were getting this intense sunbeam directly into this tank, directly hitting the corals in question. And if I had to guess, for an hour or two, maybe they were getting 1,000+ par. Clearly, that's not spectacular. I could cover the window, but then I was also thinking, we don't have a system where we would get that kind of lighting intensity. And we kind of need that lighting intensity for specifically corals like yellow Fiji leathers. And that kind of got me thinking about leathers in general for this tank, because there is exactly one big toadstool leather in here, and it is arguably the most spectacular coral in this entire tank. I mean, granted, Holy Grail torches and stuff like that are cool, but I was thinking about how amazing it would look to really showcase things that do super well in bright, bright daylight aquariums, like yellow Fiji leathers. And there's several other types of leathers that we just have farming, but we never really showcase. And so that kind of got me inspired to really dramatically change the coral selection that we have in here to make it a lot more leather coral dominant. So you may be wondering, doesn't a lot of leather corals propose a difficulty with chemical warfare? Um, that is something that is possible. It's certainly something that gets talked a lot about in reef aquarium circles, about the chemical toxicity of a lot of leather corals. That's something that I want to investigate more into, like reef receipts type publications, because I have kept lots of big leathers with SPS. and not had those SPS die, like specifically Acropora. And I would think that that's a sort of coral that would be most sensitive to that type of warfare. And I haven't really noticed it. But going a step further, we are running ozone, not super aggressively in this tank, but pretty aggressively. I'm standing here next to one of these MRC protein skimmers, and this guy is, in addition to a ridiculous wastewater treatment system, it cranks through our ozone. We've got one of those Poseidon ozone units, the Poseidon 200s, and that is essentially what is being fed into this guy here. If there is some chemical warfare going on from that show tank, this is likely one of the big steps in breaking a lot of that stuff down. The next thing that I want to point out in this tank, I want to see if he'll come out for us, but we have an Achilles Tang, and he is absolutely gorgeous. I didn't realize how lucky we were when we got him through quarantine and into here successfully, because I had recorded a few podcasts with Elliot from Marine Collectors, and of all the fish in this entire facility, he was just blown away by this Achilles Tang. He's like, do you realize how difficult it is to keep Achilles tangs? And the fact that you've had it for as long as you've had, because I think that we've had him now for a good 4 years at this point, and he is spotless, completely pristine looking, healthy, eating well. And he was like, sell it to me. I've got I think a 1,200-gallon Hawaiian biotope. It would be perfect for him. Please sell me this fish. And I'm like, I really want to keep it. It's one of our favorite fish. But part of me is like thinking, it's going so well now. I'm probably gonna screw it up by not selling it to him because he might just like fall over dead the next day now that I'm paying attention to it. But that is one of the signature fish of this aquarium. And yeah, I'm absolutely thrilled that he's doing well. Did you notice anything peculiar about this tank yet? Be honest. Okay, I'll spoil it for you. This tank has what many would consider a plague population of Astorina starfish, which, from what I understand now, they're not Astorinas, they're Aquilinastra stars. They are those white, rapidly reproducing starfish, and many in the hobby consider them a pest. This is one of the situations where I think that anything that is a fast multiplying critter in our tanks kind of gets this label slapped on them of being a pest. And I gotta say, this is my little hot take for the video, but this is one of the situations where the hobby is so incredibly off base because these little guys are S tier detritivores and cleanup crew. I would argue that they might be the best to ever do it. That's how good they are. The biggest knock, other than the fact that they replicate a lot, is that certain species of them have been seen munching on corals. It is definitely possible. We have seen it specifically with stuff like Possilopora, but those are like larger, more brown in color, and you can literally pick them off very easily. There's a lot of things that eat corals that we put up with. For example, look at this big giant blimp of a fish. He is a show specimen in here, this big flamingi tang. It turns out that he loves to eat Duncans. He loves to eat Australophilia. He's been seen chewing on Pectinia. Yeah, total wild card. He is beloved in this place. The other thing, see this copper band. We can't keep Micromusa or Blastomusa and these copper bands in the same tank. But again, we put up with it because of their over-the-top utility controlling Aptasia. It's one of those things, there's no perfect cleanup crew, there's no perfect utilitarian organisms. Given the utility of these starfish, the fact that the smallest minority of them can bother corals is a non-issue for me. There is kind of like this double standard when it comes to cleanup crew, because on one hand, people don't like these starfish, but on the other hand, they have absolutely no problem with something like a tuxedo urchin that is sometimes the size of your fist, that grabs large objects and goes trekking all around your tank with it, that bulldozes stuff constantly. And on top of that, costs between $20 to $40 and likes to die occasionally. Whereas these guys basically are immortal. They are just incredible, incredible scavengers. Like, the cleanliness of this tank has nothing to do with our efforts, because our show tanks in general get pretty highly neglected. Of all of our show tanks, this tank gets the most neglected. Like I said, it's chaos theory in here. Nobody pays any attention to this tank, trust me. But this tank, compared to any of the other show tanks, compared to any of our farming tanks, is practically spotless. The rocks have no detritus on them, seemingly. It is so polished clean, and it's because of these starfish. I think that the effect of these starfish being kind of an eyesore is really overblown. We were talking about how bright this tank gets, and it turns out that these starfish don't like the brightness. So during the day, when you're basically seeing these tanks, uh, they're all gone and hiding for most of the day. So if it's a bright, well-illuminated tank, you likely won't see more than a handful ever. And trust me, there are thousands in here. Now, just because like we are a coral farm, I realize people don't want these starfish in their tanks. This tank is sort of hard separated from the rest of the systems because we're using a filter sock assembly. So there are no starfish really in any of the farming tanks in the same system. But believe me, if the attitude of the customer base changes, these starfish would be in every single one of our systems on purpose, because that's how good of a job they do. It would save so many corals. It would save so many hours in labor. It would save on so much money on other cleanup crew that don't do as good a job as these guys do. So anyways, that is my plant the flag moment on these starfish. They are awesome. All right, guys, we will finish up with a little bit of chemistry. I know that in some past videos, people are always interested in tank parameters for the systems that we have here. So the tank that we just looked at, it's got an alkalinity of 8.6, calcium of 430, magnesium of 1330, nitrates at 10 parts per million, and phosphates at 0.1, which is a tad bit higher than the other two big systems that we have here. All the other parameters more or less the same, but the other two have really low phosphate in my opinion. The tank that has most of the SPS in it has a phosphate level of 0.04, and that is like a little bit scary low for me. But our biggest system, our biggest, newest system, has a phosphate of 0.02, and that's only because it's not 0. That's the first time that we've ever been able to even get a phosphate reading. So ideally, I tend to like to see something closer to like that 0.1. The tank that we just saw, that kind of has our sweet spot phosphate level. But everything else is pretty much in line with natural seawater levels, and that's what we're looking for. We do not get that experimental when it comes to like the major testing elements. Everything else, as far as trace and stuff like that, it's our get off of 0 policy. Yeah, nothing fancy. We're super vanilla here when it comes to chemistry. Anyways, guys, thanks for hanging out with us after hours, and I'll see you next time. Happy reefing.